I realized the Declaration's actually a covenant. And it was a covenant that our founders made with God to start this nation.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, many people don't like to hear this, but nations such as the United States and Canada were founded as Christian nations. In the United States, they're described as one nation under God. In the Canadian Constitution, it states specifically that all of our laws are subject to the supremacy of God and the rule of law. But as we look around today and we experience what's happening in our communities, in our universities, in our schools, and even in our churches, let alone what's happening in our government, it doesn't look very much like God is present. It certainly doesn't look like we're operating things on any sort of Christian basis. Many of us are very concerned about that, not the least of whom is our guest, who's taken the time to actually write a book about it. And his name is Mark Burrell. Welcome to the show, Mark. Thanks for being with us today on Grey Matter.
Thanks for having me, Leighton.
Okay, I'm excited to talk to you about your book and the other work that you've been doing. Before we get there, we have some framing aphorisms on our show that have been selected in your honor. These are some titans of American history, of the originalist American history, one of whom is John Adams, who wrote this. He says, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." George Washington said, "It is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God and the Bible." Thomas Jefferson said, "I have examined all as well as my narrow sphere. My straitened means and my busy life would allow me, and the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world." And one more from your website. This is from Alexander Hamilton. "For my part, I sincerely esteem the Constitution a system which, without the finger of God, never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interests." So, Mark, perhaps we could start, as it were, at the beginning. How did you? What motivated you to begin researching and writing this book? What was your inspiration for doing this?
So I've had a Bible teaching ministry for over 30 years. And one of the most important parts of that journey for me was a mentor that I had that took me through systematic theology early on. And I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but I didn't learn much. And so I have an engineering background, and I really wanted to better understand, is the Bible like reasonable? And does it make sense? And I had all these questions. And so I got rooted in that for a few years with my mentor. And at the same time, I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. And so I grew up, going to Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and all these areas. And was always taught that we were a Christian nation, as you mentioned with your intro. But the question that was nagging at me, and it started with this question, was if the revolution was all about, taxation without representation, which and the Bible says that we should pay our taxes. The nagging tension I had in my head was, well, how could the revolution have been biblically justifiable if, in fact, we're supposed to pay our taxes? And at that point, I was going through this systematic theology with my mentor, and I thought to myself, I should probably figure that out at some point. So this is the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
And then through the 90s, I started picking up books that had to do with American founding. I started to find books that had a lot of the quotes that you just read in. And the quotes are inspiring, Leighton. But the question I had really was, what does the Bible have to say about it? Right. And so with my systematic theology training, I realized around 2000 that I needed to just go through the Bible, look for all the verses that had to do with liberty and justice and rights and governing, and put them on the table and try and figure out for myself, where does that take you in terms of what does God expect from the nations? And should Christians be engaged in civil government? And when I got to the end of that journey, I was flabbergasted at how much information is actually in the Bible. And I started to incorporate that into my teaching. And then around 2010, I started to realize that that approach of going to the Bible first, understanding the theology, and then talking about how that was woven into the history, that I really didn't see that in all the books I was reading. And so I felt like God was leading me to write a book. And it took 10 years. And I finally got to the point where it was released about a year ago.
So Mark, you draw an important distinction in your work that is missed by many people. And that is the distinction between the Declaration of Independence, as in 1776, which you regard as very seminal to the founding of the American nation, obviously. Distinction between that and the Constitution, which came along later, I believe between about 1787 and 1791. What's the importance of that distinction for you in terms of the founding of the American nation and this covenant you talk about?
Yeah. So the Constitution is simply our operating document. It's the how, and it's version 2.0. If you know your American history, you know that our first version were the Articles of Confederation. They turned out to have some weaknesses in that the founders are very concerned about giving a federal government too much control. But with the Articles, they frankly didn't have enough control, and the states were doing their own thing. So they got together in 1787, as you mentioned, to try and fix that. But a few people had done some pre-work and said, this isn't fixable. We've got to do something totally different. And then we got to the version we have today. But the question is, what informs the Constitution? What is the why behind America? Because the Constitution is the how.
Right.
And so the why is, in fact, the Declaration of Independence. And what I came to appreciate, Leighton, when I did all this research, was that the Declaration is not a Dear John letter to King George, basically saying,
Right.
We're leaving. Here are the reasons why. See you later. It's really not what it was. What the founders did was they followed the same pattern as Old Testament Israel in establishing their nation officially in the eyes of God. That happened in Exodus 19 through 24. Started with Moses coming down with the 10 Commandments, which is the moral law. You gave that great John Adams quote. Basically, what they were saying is, if you don't recognize this moral law, this law of nature and of nature's God, nothing good will come of it, because that's the starting point.
Right.
And so what I realized is that when I took a closer look at the Declaration, after I had teased out these principles, which we can talk more about, I realized the Declaration's actually a covenant. And it was
Right.
a covenant that our founders made with God to start this nation. And the theology that's wrapped inside that declaration is just amazing. And we can unpack that some more. But that's the difference.
Yeah.
The Declaration is the why. It's our American identity. And the Constitution is the how. It's how we're supposed to be operating.
I want to unpack that, as you say, but before we go there, I wonder if you wouldn't mind, Mark, and I know you do this in the book, you talk a little bit about this word, this covenant, because it's a very special kind of a relationship with God, isn't it? But it's foundational to what's to the Declaration of Independence, and really about proper governance of human beings in terms of being a nation that is proper in the sight of God. And one of the really interesting things about your book I really liked is that it really reveals to us that all of the secrets, all the principles we need to have a proper functioning state are actually in the Bible. Would you mind just explaining a little bit more about this covenant concept? Because some people might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, so the word covenant, it's an old-fashioned term these days, but it's simply a contract. It's an agreement. And if I could draw a distinction to or make an analogy to what we're talking about here, this is no different than a marriage covenant. So
Right.
A lot of people listening to your show are probably married. So just follow me for a second on how a marriage covenant actually gets consummated. There's 4 things that happen. The first thing is you acknowledge God and God's plan for marriage when you're in a marriage ceremony. And the founders did that in the first paragraph. In that case, they were acknowledging God's plan for nations and how a nation should govern. The first 2 paragraphs, the first really 3 or 4 sentences summarize the theology behind civil government. The second thing you do in a marriage is you appeal to God to bless the union. And the founders did the same thing. If you look at the last paragraph, of the Declaration, you'll see the distinct sentence that says, with an appeal to heaven to the supreme judge of the world. I'm
Yes.
butchering it a little bit,
Yeah.
but it couldn't be more clear. They're saying, we need your help. And of course, they would need their help because they were standing up to the empire of the world at the time. There's no reason why they should have been successful, by the way. The third
Providence.
thing that
Providence.
yeah, well, I would say it's because they followed the biblical template.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but back to the marriage thing. So first you acknowledge God and his intention for marriage or his intention for nations. Second thing is you appeal for help. Third thing is you commit to it. And in a marriage, you commit by reciting vows and exchanging rings. It's a really big deal. It's the it's the most important thing that you can do in that ceremony. The founders took it one step further, because remember that last incredible sentence. They basically say they're pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, essentially to see the thing through. I don't know how much more committed you could be, other than to sign the document, which is what they did, which immediately meant if they were caught, that they'd be hung for treason.
And many of them were. I mean, it's a trail of
They
tears,
were.
isn't it? That story is not told enough, is it? Most of the
No,
men
not
who
a lot
suffered-
of them survived the war. The
Yeah.
handful that did became president. So then there's the last thing. The last thing that you do in a marriage is think about what's the last thing that happens in a ceremony. The pastor officiating turns the couple around and they say, for the first time, in public, introducing, and in my case, it was Mark and Charlene Burrell. And what are they doing? They're declaring publicly that this marriage has taken place. That's the whole purpose for the marriage ceremony.
Right.
Well, the founders did the same thing. Number one, they named the document a declaration. And then number two, they sent it around the colonies and to England for all to see that this is what they were declaring. And Leighton clearly God honored the process they followed, which I submit is completely biblical, because he allowed them under overwhelming odds in order to win the war and then start the nation. So those are principles to start a nation.
Right.
So we can talk more about principles to govern a nation, but that's what happened in the Declaration of Independence.
Is it your thesis that that the founders were doing this intentionally? That is, framing the Declaration in the context and in the form of this historical covenant that you talk about that's found in the Bible?
They absolutely did, and they weren't the first people to do it. One of the earliest known records to do it that most historians recognize is the Pilgrim Landing in 1620. Right. So recall what happened there. They were on their way to join the Jamestown colony, but the prevailing winds would not let them go south. They concluded that it was God's will to form a colony north where they had landed, which they named Plymouth. But there was a problem. There was no governing authority there. And so their pastor had taught them, well, here's what you do if you're starting a new nation. You establish a covenant. And if you read the Mayflower Compact, it's like one paragraph. It's not even that long. You'll see that they followed the same process. They acknowledged God, why they were there. They appealed to God for help. The whole thing starts with amen, which means let it be so. It's basically appealing. And then they explained very clearly their intent to form a civil body politic. They commit to it by signing the document. And of course, they declared it with the people that were there. It was done on the Mayflower. The ship crew understood what they were doing. There was no internet or, way to get it out, but they followed that same pattern. And so with the First Great Awakening and all the pastors of that era, reinforcing the importance of self-government, they knew what to do. They didn't want to do it, but they felt they were backed into a corner. And when it came time, they put their faith into practice. And that's really what they were doing. They were putting their faith into practice, and God honored their commitment.
Right. So we have this concept of a covenant that you've explained that's between a people and God. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament. But then we have this other complicating feature that enters this covenant called government. And so is the government part of that covenant or outside of that covenant? This seems to me an important concept.
So I would say it's the way you operationalize the covenant, the covenant. And so what I do in the book, and for folks reading it, I go into about 7 principles that I tease out of looking at, what God instructed the Jewish nation to do upon, Moses essentially officiating the starting of the nation. That was the
Right.
official start, and they consented. Remember, Moses came down and said, God says if we follow this moral law, he'll bless us. And they all agreed. That was giving their consent. That's where the term under the consent of the governed comes from,
Right. Yes.
which is really interesting. If I go on a little theological detour, remember
Please
the
do.
Abrahamic,
Yes.
the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. And so you got this great question. Why would the Jews accept a deal conditional on their performance for God to bless them? Because it was unconditional before that. My mentor used to always make a joke about that. Why did they take that deal? They should have not taken the deal. But the point is, that's what you do if you're getting
Right.
married, or you're establishing a community or a business or a church. You mentioned I've been involved in starting churches. That's what you do. You write it down, you sign it. So essentially, the government and whatever process you come up with is all in service to bring to life and to realize the vision in your covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And a government authority that does not do that, and in fact is governing immorally over a long period of time, becomes a real problem. Because remember, that was the operational principle behind the
Right.
American founding.
Right.
They had concluded that the government had been governing immorally.
Right.
so-
And to use your analogy, you talk about, which is a great one, talking about the marriage covenant. The importance of that is it brings God into that relationship, so that let's say if you stray and you cheat on your spouse, that's not as simple as doing something to hurt your spouse. You've also offended God. You've broken God's law. So applying that analogy to government, you go through some of the history of American governance, and you chart how at certain times the American state has sort of gone astray, and whenever it has, it's gone into it's landed in some trouble. Do you want to explain about that a little bit? I found this was a very fascinating part of your book.
So yeah, if I talk about how do we get to where we are today, I think maybe that's what you're referring to,
yeah.
the lead in. So yeah, and that's the first chapter. It's called The State of the Union, and the subtitle is How You Forget Your Covenant, which
Right.
by the way, Israel did all the time. And so what happened there was a series of events, and I just hit the big events. There's probably many more you could cite. But in America, the key event that seemed to trigger this departure from our Christian roots was a ruling in 1947 that's basically, this is where this term, separation of church and state, was first expressed as a legal principle. And the ironic thing is the judge in that case, Hugo Black, who ironically did not have much experience as a judge, by the way, he basically said that in the words of Jefferson, we've got to keep separate the church and state. We got to have this wall, and it has to be inseparable. And he's in fact completely misquoting what Jefferson said in this private letter to the Danbury Baptist Church, who had asked him upon winning the presidency if the government would potentially encroach on the Danbury Baptist denomination, because in Virginia, they were locking up pastors going down and evangelizing. And so Jefferson pens this wonderful response, and I have that a section of it in the book, where I basically he says, no, the government cannot do that. But in 1947, Hugo Black twists it 180 degrees and says the church cannot encroach in governing affairs. And within 15 years, the prayer was determined to be unconstitutional. After 350 years of praying in schoolhouses in America, it was suddenly deemed unconstitutional. And then the next year, Bible reading was deemed unconstitutional. And once that happened, you see the moral law, that law of nature and of nature's God, which is a phrase that refers to the moral law, which is summarized by the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments have been slowly pulled from our public view. And when that happens, that quote from John Adams,
Right.
You no longer have a moral nation. And so it just doesn't work.
That talking about the Ten Commandments, that reminds me of something I read in one of Dennis Prager's book. He's written a series of wonderful books. One of them is called The Rational Bible. And he talks about the Ten Commandments in a way that I never thought of them. He said that these are basically God's laws, that to the extent you follow them, you are free. You're free from the bondage of sin. And it seems to me that has particular application when we're talking about the state, because, when people think of America, they think of freedom. When you go around the world, that's what people think of. I can tell you that's the impression in Canada. But what's the source of the freedom? And the source of the freedom, I think, is God's law and that covenant. One of the themes of your book, if I have it right, is that to the extent that America has strayed from that covenant, then the people become less free. In other words, where God is, people are free, and where God isn't, we tend to be slaves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Prager's got these 5-minute videos. He's got 10
they're
of those
brilliant, aren't they? Yeah.
He's got 10 of those, one for each of the 10 commandments, and they're dynamite. I encourage your readers. That's a quick way to get what you were describing. So the moral law, this is one of the things I learned in my personal journey, is just how important the moral law is in everything. So we can say this: the moral law, number one, summarizes God's standard of righteousness. It tells us about God, about the God who loves us. That's pretty important.
Yeah.
Number two, it shows us we can't measure up, which is pretty important because it should drive us to the foot of the cross and accept him. And then number three, to your point, if you follow the moral law, it's the best way for you to have a fulfilling and productive life where God will shower his blessings on you. I remember when my daughter, I've got 4 kids, and a real pivotal moment for me was when my then 20-year-old daughter said to me, I finally realized that the 10 commandments are just there to help me. If I follow the 10 commandments, I'll probably have a better life. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. And then lastly, the fourth intent of the 10 commandments is it serves as the legal standard for all legitimate lawmaking.
Yes.
It literally is the rule of law. When you hear people talk about, we got to follow the rule of law, what progressives mean is if we pass a law, you've got to follow it.
Yeah.
That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that this divine law that permeates and sustains the universe, it's in effect at all times and at all places, and it must be respected. That is actually the rule of law that everything must be measured against.
Another piece that you wrote that was really interesting is this, and this is going back a little bit back to last February, and this gets at some of the traditions, cultural traditions in the West and in America. Is President's Day under attack? You wrote a piece about this, and you explained that this is part of the progressive attack on that covenant. You want to explain about that a little bit? Because it has broader implications than just President's Day. It applies also to things like Independence Day, Christmas, Easter, all of that, right? All of those things, Thanksgiving, all these things that are cultural traditions that are connected to the covenant that you write about in your book, right?
Yeah, so if we look at Israel, and again, everything you need to know about this, you can learn principles from the nation of Israel. And so what did God do after they established Israel? What did he do to help reinforce the most important principles? They established the 7 feasts that occur every year throughout the year. Each feast has an important meaning. And the founders were really aware of this when America started. Their question was, what will be our traditions? Israel's got the feasts, and these were critical around, and they were central to Jewish life.
Right.
What will be the American corollary to that? And so over the years, we have figured some out. One of the early ones was Thanksgiving, this idea of celebrating, in this case, the harvest. So it was celebrated in the fall, and that became an early one. Christmas is a holiday. And actually, Christmas wasn't celebrated that much until the last 70 or 80 years. But obviously, it's become a big deal. But President's Day is a great example of honoring a few presidents. Washington, who legitimately is the father of the nation. If we didn't have Washington, I don't think we'd have America. And then Lincoln, who saved America in the Civil War. They both had birthdays in February, so we established President's Day as a holiday in February. These 2 men were central in founding and helping to save America. And their stories should be told. What was unique about Washington? What was unique about Lincoln? But if you take away President's Day, you're taking away one more little opportunity to plant a seed, just like the Jewish feasts had these feasts, these 7 rituals that they would go through. They were all opportunities to remind the Jewish people about God and how faithful he was, how he delivered them, how he loved them, how he wanted to tabernacle with them. And so this is why it's so dangerous to get rid of these various holidays, because they're getting rid of the traditions that help provide teachable moments and that help us realize our American identity,
Right. So
which is wrapped up in our covenant.
Right. This is the part of the show where we sort of wrap up, and we call it the reading list. We've learned so much from talking with you, Mark. I'm really grateful that you took this time with us. It won't surprise you that your book is our featured book. We also have another book, if you can call it a book. It's called The Declaration of Independence. And this is one that is narrated by Keith Verge. And are there any books or resources or even parts of the Bible that you think would be very useful for people to read so that they could gain a better understanding of both your book and the topics that we've been discussing today?
So the first thing I want to mention to your audience is the next time you have July 4th, I realize you're a Canadian audience, but what we're starting to do is we read the Declaration aloud as a family on July 4th.
Yeah.
The second thing is there is a book by Larry Arnn called The Founder's Key, and it is about the Declaration of Independence and his take. Now, Larry Arnn's the president of Hillsdale College. Hillsdale actually helped me out a little bit with my book. I had a chance meeting with Larry, and he's turned out to be a great friend and mentor. And all things Hillsdale, I would recommend to people. They have online classes you can take for free. They're excellent.
We just want to thank you so much for being our special guest here today on Gray Matter.
Thanks for having me, Leighton. I really enjoyed our conversation.